Welcome to 4C Radio. We are broadcasting from the central campus of Christ University, Bangalore. 4C Radio is brought to you by the Department of Media Studies of Christ University. For all who are looking for a platform that focuses on communities, commons, climate, and communication, this is the place to be. What's more, this station is run by a diverse community of students and dedicated faculty members. Tune in to experience hard hitting interviews, fact checks, and myth busting, on ground stories, campus news, and more. In today's episode, we listen to independent journalist Dr. Amoolya Rajappa. Amoolya is a Bangalore-based independent journalist and reports on labor, internal migration, climate change, and displacement in India. She teaches journalism courses at Christ University. She spoke to Prachi Pinglay about her story on the impact of indoor heat on people's lives in Bangalore. The story was published in Migration Story in May and was later also carried by the Guardian newspaper.
Hi Amoolya, thank you very much for joining today. We are here to talk about your detailed reportage on indoor heat that you did in May, and it was published in Migration Story and later co-published in The Guardian. So I would like to ask you a few questions about just that story and how you did it and what were your takeaways about it. So glad to have you and thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me, Prachi. Pleasure being here and look forward to discussing about my story.
Very first question, what's the story about? What is it exactly?
The story is about indoor heat and its impact on migrant workers in the city of Bengaluru. So when we were otherwise ideating on a series of stories on heat and its disproportionate impact on vulnerable communities, this was one concept that we otherwise thought was unaccounted for in regular reportage, which is the concept of indoor heat. Every time the temperatures peak up, the first directive and the government circulars that we get to see say stay indoors, which is a huge luxury for many daily wage workers, internal migrant communities. And even if they stay indoors, it is not true that the indoors are always cool. And, many of them live in very cramped shanties and informal settlements that lack any kind of ventilation. They're poorly built. So indoor heat is a different phenomenon that...
So how did you really go about reporting this? Like, how did you find the places where you had to go? How did you meet the people? Did you decide beforehand what the story was going to be? Or did you go along the way and how did you find different things? Because as you said, this is a phenomenon that's not really discussed much in the public domain. So just as a reporter, if you could share how you went about reporting and what did you find?
Well, I think the entire process was very, very organic. The only thing I otherwise consciously planned is the different kind of field sites to pick, because I want them to be different from one another. Not all informal settlements look alike. In a particular community, water comes like every alternate day. There are communities where they buy water per unit. What is the impact of all of that on heat and how they're taking care of themselves? So I did my fieldwork in very varied settlements. Ones where people lived in cramped shanties, concrete structures, vis-a-vis tin roofed sheds, tarpaulin covered spaces. So I consciously planned it that way so that I go and visit multiple field sites. And the second thing was to ensure that I speak to different members of the family. Usually when we say migrant workers, it's not a unit as such. Again, when it comes to indoor heat, it differently impacts women, it differently impacts elderly. The kids are affected and kids roaming around without their clothes was a very common sight when I was doing my reportage. So to also speak to different populations within the demographic. And the last was to factor in all the opinions possible. So what's the government's reaction? When they say stay indoors, is it feasible? What are you otherwise doing on the policy front? And the academic space as well. If there is any research done on it, why are we not otherwise popularizing whatever scant literature there is about indoor heat? So I think that is about it. But in terms of how I did my interviews, I just let it be. So I think it was multiple visits, going to the same space, speaking to the same kind of people. Yeah.
Roughly, how long were you reporting on it? How long were you working on the story?
3 weeks. 3 weeks was it, yeah. Because otherwise, the key challenge somehow was when I first went about doing the story, they found it really difficult to articulate the lived experience of indoor heat. They kept saying, yes, it is hot, but is there a way out of it? So the conversations were cut short by their kind of like giving into the situation and then saying, there's nothing we can do about it. So why are we even discussing it? Otherwise, had to ask them questions find out ways to ask the same question in different ways. Like, so how does it impact you when you're cooking indoors? And so your medical expenses, do they shoot up? How often do you have to cool yourself, wash yourself? And how are you sourcing water for all of it? So we had to approach it like that.
And when you spend so much time, visiting these places, almost little bit living their lives, for some time at least, how did it affect you? What I'm trying to ask is not what has gone into the story, but outside of it, how did it really impact you? How did it affect you? How did you feel about being there, for so long?
To answer that positively, I mean, some stories, doesn't happen always, but then some journalistic assignments remind you why you fell in love with journalism in the first place. I think I would say this was one of such stories. The process of it was very difficult. It was that physical discomfort. I think, it made it easier for me to account for all those narratives because it was being inside those shanties and understanding that it is really hot. It's like a baking oven inside. And if you're pregnant or if you're on medications for epilepsy, so it's very difficult, it's extremely difficult. Just the physical discomfort of being indoors when the fans just circulating hot air, when you can't open windows because, you can't let the mosquitoes come in and bother you in the night. So the lived experience was like, it is very hot indoors. So I could empathize with them better if that is how I want to put it. But then how did it affect me? I don't know. Obviously, you reflect on your privileges better. Yeah, it's one such story which I sat for a very long time about, okay, how do I write this? I've lived it, I've heard them. Then, I've also, spoken to so many different people. So now how do I process all of it and, fit it into a narrative was the...
Whenever we go out reporting, there's always some one incident or one person or maybe couple of them who kind of stay with you for longer time. Did you find any such experience or anecdotes, or I would say meet one or two people who you think about even now?
Like I said, one of the women I spoke to, she was pregnant. She was 7 months pregnant. I was pregnant during COVID and I thought that was difficult. When you meet other people, who are battling like extraordinary circumstances to just keep themselves cool. She was earlier with her husband in a pakka house with a tin roof shed, but that heats up so much and she had very little social support surrounding her space. So she has now shifted to the tarpaulin covered space only to stay cool and then get some better help. And so if that is what indoor heat is doing to you, then, actually giving up on piped water supply and coming to a place where she has to purchase water per unit. Almelu, I think, one of the women I spoke to, so she can only cook rice at one time and then switch off the stove and then let the air escape for a while and then again take a break and then cook dal. So such instances were like, that'll stay with me for a while.
When we take all this in, we also feel that apart from writing, of course, you have already written about it and it's out in the public domain. But would you want to share with us a few sort of takeaways that either policymakers or administration or government or academics could benefit from? Like, what can we do about this and what should we be advocating for?
Well, I think the easiest would be to populate the labor space and the migration related reportage space with more stories on indoor heat. Talk about phenomena that otherwise aren't being factored in, accounted for. So asking the right questions, I think, would be a good start. That is what I would think is like, a win-win for to begin with. Because otherwise, like I said, most often it's the heat island effect that gets talked about, urban heat, disproportionate impact. But even when you say stay indoors, like it isn't the greatest solution because, there's a lot of unsustainable building practices. And in Bangalore is such a place where usually the heat wave criteria is not often met because the temperatures do not peak at a stretch for a very long time for it to be counted as heat wave. So what then is impacting them more is unsustainable building practices because a lot of migrants lack bargaining power. They're at the mercy of their tekadars who will take the easy option out to put them in any sort of accommodation that they can possibly think of for cheaper options. So populating the space, reporting on it more would be a good start. Currently, only 2 heat action plans, city-wise heat action plans, only Rajkot and Bhubaneswar speak about indoor heat disproportionately impacting vulnerable populations. So a lot of cities across India are in the process of drafting their heat action plans. At the municipal level, I think it's time that they acknowledge this as a separate phenomenon and then account for it. And then only when the acknowledgement is done is when we can think about mitigation and building resilience. Okay. So I think that would be populating the space and then asking the right questions and holding people accountable.
Thank you so much. I was just thinking about, when we were discussing this, when we had the climate change reporting workshop in December, and we had resource people talking about various effects of climate change. And one of the things that was mentioned was flash droughts. And when I tried to do an explainer on it, I kind of stumbled on the fact that flash droughts is not something that gets into any policy as of now, because it is for much shorter time than a traditional drought, right? So it becomes nobody's business in that sense,
True.
and yet it is affecting soil, it is affecting output, it is affecting everything. So yeah, I think we really need to talk more about this so that it finds its way into climate action plans, heat action plans, and maybe how to build cities for migrant laborers, or
Well, I think that should be a
Yeah.
starting point for for so many things, right?
Yeah.
Basic acknowledgement. They're living on the fringes of the city, both in terms of the geography and spatial alignment, and in terms of mainstream
Yes.
consciousness.
Yeah.
So bring in those narratives mainstream.
And I keep thinking that, when COVID happened and we saw the mass migration, that things would change, but as soon as everything ended, we quickly went back to how we felt about things before COVID. So
Well, at least, I mean, after the pandemic, it's no longer the elephant in the room. I mean,
Yeah.
people know that, there is this scale of, at least people have woken up to the scale, the massive scale and patterns of internal migration in India. But in terms of, like I said, mainstreaming those narratives, getting policy to act on it is a far-fetched dream. But the effort is on. I mean,
thank you so much, and I'm so I really appreciate the work that you do, because you're really bringing together the stories of migration, environment, and labor issues. So I think these are all extremely crucial questions of our times. So thank you very much, and thank you for your reportage, and thank you for doing this today.
thank you so much. Thank you. Pleasure.
Doing more in whatever capacity is crucial to creating tangible and intangible impact for climate mitigation and adaptation. So, if you are a reporter like Amoolya, do more stories. If you are a student, read, think, and discuss more. If you are a policymaker, please work on more equitable policies. And if you are a citizen, which we all are, keep asking questions to your representatives. In the sixth and last episode of Environment Week, we will listen to Dr. Madhav Gadgil again as he talks about people he met in his journey, how some inspired him, how the sacrifice of some remains etched in his mind till date, and why scientists must speak to people and speak in the language of people. The climate story is still unfolding, and we are here to follow it. This podcast was illustrated by Vernika Singh and was edited by Srinivas Aditya. Please write to us and follow 4C Radio on Instagram and X. Until next time, be curious and ask questions. 4C Radio is an initiative by the Department of Media Studies, Christ University, Bangalore.